I'm going to go ahead and begin. We have kind of a full morning. I'm Jean Donham. I'm the president of the Church Council, but more importantly, I'm a lifelong educator. Before I entered higher education, I spent 23 years working in K-12 education in public schools in Ames and Iowa City. My contemporaries and I sometimes get together and say, you know, we worked in public education at the best time for public education in this country, the golden years of public education in our minds. Today, we're going to talk about today's public education, however, and some of the unfortunate trends that we see occurring around public education in this country. So I entitled this presentation, What Happened to Our Trust in Public Education? And I don't know about you, but when I was in school, there was no questioning the authority of teachers. My parents supported teachers 100%, no matter how much we kids might have complained. Teachers were, well, perhaps not well paid, were respected in our communities, and teaching was a highly regarded profession. My parents were proud of my choice in education. Today, educators seem to be under the gun. A vocal, I would say, minority of parents criticize the schools and call for legislation that I consider demeaning of teachers and other educators, and their voices are amplified by social media. The pressures for privatization of schools seems to continue to increase. It's difficult to point to a single reason for this decline in trust. Is it racial? Is it religious? Is it an anti-intellectual movement? Is it the result of disinformation and misinformation in social media? Is it an outcome of our political divisiveness? We could probably spend the entire morning speculating about what has precipitated this situation. But instead, let's look at its consequences, and perhaps seeing those consequences will compel us to seek ways to repair this lack of trust for the sake of our society. I'd like to share a few brief excerpts from the ELCA social statements that seem relevant to today's topic. Let me share, first of all, a social statement entitled Freed in Christ, Race, Ethnicity, and Culture. It states, the Christ to whom the church witnesses is the Christ who breaks down walls of cultural exclusivity. We of the ELCA have recognized ourselves to be in mission and ministry in a multicultural society and have committed ourselves to welcome cultural diversity. From a social statement entitled The Church and Society, a Lutheran Perspective. This church respects the God-given integrity and tasks of governing authorities and other worldly structures while holding them accountable to God. They are to recognize the vital role of law in protecting life and liberty and in upholding the common good. And I would ask you to keep that concept of the common good in mind this morning. From a social statement on our calling in education. In light of the essential role of public education in serving the common good of the society, and in the face of continuing concern for the effectiveness of some public schools, the lack of equitable access for many students to high-quality schools, and the often inadequate provision of financial resources, the ELCA affirms and advocates for the equitable, sufficient, and effective funding of public schools. And finally, a social statement on our calling in education further. We of the ELCA view public schools with gratitude. We rejoice in the opportunity for education that public schools offer to all children, including children who suffer the effects of poverty and discrimination, and to children with special learning needs. We recognize how public schools in various situations bring together children and youth from many different social, economic, and ethnic backgrounds, including those from new immigrant populations, for a common education in a spirit of civic equality. I find each of those statements particularly powerful And I find each of them particularly germane to our commitment to public education. In 1983, A Nation at Risk ushered in an era of accountability in education. It was followed later by such legislation as No Child Left Behind and other legislation that brought an increased emphasis on the use of test scores to measure not only academic achievement, but later also teacher effectiveness. Prudence Carter, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at UCLA, at UC Berkeley, my mistake. Oh, she would not like that. Whoops. At UC Berkeley, teaches her students that A Nation at Risk was a pivotal moment in education policy, the beginning of a moment of angst, she calls it, about the state of the nation's schools. Subsequent legislation like No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act placed greater and greater emphasis on testing. Did we really think that taking the temperature of the patient would make the patient feel better? As accountability efforts have increased, other themes related to inclusivity, equity, social movements, and cultural issues have contributed to public expressions of distrust. And that brings us to our focus for today: an apparent lack of societal trust in public education and public school educators. I'm going to talk today about some examples of legislation that reveal that lack of trust in professional educators. Some of this legislation affects classroom teachers, and of course, I will have to share some of the legislation that affects school librarians, my special friends. I'll be talking about some bills that have become law, some that have not. That said, the very introduction of some bills signals to educators a lack of confidence in their professional work and creates substantial distress in an already very highly stressed profession. Be aware that these bills are often generated by special interest groups. They distribute bills on model legislation among legislators across the country, and hence we see common language in bills from state to state. USA Today analyzed legislation from 2010 to 2018 and found more than 10,000 bills introduced into state legislatures that had been copied from model legislation. The most famous bill generator is probably ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, but there are other more narrowly focused groups like No Left Turn in Education, whose particular aim is against any teaching related to racial issues, or the Manhattan Institute with similar aims, the ACLU, of course, on the other side, and even the League of American Bicyclists produces model legislation. I find this trend, though, particularly damaging to our notion of living democratically, where I would like to see local legislation be local. I would like to see legislation that comes up from the people instead of down from special interests. Interestingly, the Center for Public Integrity maintains a database where you can track legislation, and it reveals similar bills from state to state. So if you enter a bill, it will find other bills that match it. These data clearly reveal the nationalization of state government. So we call it copy, paste, and legislate. Not only are legislatures being pressured by this nationalization from special interest groups, so are school boards, where organizations are working to train school board members in topics of interest to them. So they offer online training institutes for people aspiring to school boards or people who are on school boards to teach them how to advance their particular special agendas. And so it's no coincidence that the same issues arise in legislatures and in school boards across the country. This seems an important issue as well. Yet there's a disconnect between what goes on nationally and what goes on locally. An indication of that disconnect between national agendas and local attitudes is found in a recent Gallup survey that reveals that parents rate their own local schools, their own children's schools, quite highly. 58% of them in this Gallup poll gave their own schools an A or a B, yet only 30% of those people surveyed gave public schools writ large or public schools nationally an equally high grade. This may provide some insight into the power of the national media, including social media, disinformation campaigns and agendas related to school privatization and the discrediting of public education and their power. Well, let's look at some examples of the legislation we might be thinking about here. I want to start with the moves toward privatization of education and the public money private schools issue. This has been an issue that's been in the forefront in many states across the nation for a long time. Probably the most prominent champion of this was Betsy DeVos when she was head of the Department of Education, but it's been an issue that's been around for a long time. Many of you listened to Charity Nevy's series this week on public education. She talked, in particular, to a representative from Michigan, where they have been looking at privatization. Of course, that's where Betsy DeVos is from, but privatization for 20 years or so. So it's not a new issue, but it's one that we've seen considerable pressure for here in Iowa recently. So to talk about public schools a little background, let's talk about Horace Mann. Horace Mann served as the secretary to the Massachusetts Board of Education from 1837 to 1848. And he advocated for public schools that would adhere to specific principles. Mann was reacting to the state of education in his day, when schooling was often religious or home-based or exclusive. To paraphrase his principles, he stated that education ought to be paid for by the public, that such schools should embrace children of all religious, social, and ethnic backgrounds, that such education should be free of all sectarian religious influence, that such schools should embrace the spirit, methods, and disciplines of a free society, and that such an education can only be provided by well-trained professional teachers. Well, we live in very different times today, but it seems to me that Horace Mann's principles are still germane to schools today. We live, as we all know, in a polarized, divided, divisive society. Some of this divisiveness may be a result of our remaining in our own ideological, ethnic, economic, and racial bubbles. A consequence of that isolation can be a lack of appreciation and understanding, or even fear of, those different from ourselves. That fear at its worst can translate into hatred. Public schools are often one of the first places where children have an opportunity to interact with, befriend, agree or disagree with, and understand people of different backgrounds. They can become but private education runs the risk of diminishing children's opportunities for interactions and opportunities to grow in understanding and appreciation of people who are different from themselves. I will tell you, I am the product of K-12 private education. I had to learn a lot once I finished that private education, because my perception was that only people like me were okay. And I had to learn those lessons, that the world's bigger than my little, middle-class white universe was. And certainly that there are people throughout our society who have great value, much to contribute, and who are wonderful and enriching people. That education that I have has perhaps made me passionate about the value of public education. I think public schools then, as I say, afford the opportunity for kids to learn how to live in a pluralistic society. So issues around public funds for private schools include the impact that private money to public schools can have on public school funding, the potential for a lack of diversity, the uncertainty regarding accountability in private schools, the potential conflict with separation of church and state, and the lack of clarity on the academic outcomes of private education. There has been considerable effort to research whether private charter schools, for example, result in better educational outcomes than public schools, and the results are simply mixed. There is no definitive answer that says that privatization results necessarily in better educational outcomes. The idea of public money for private schools is likely to continue to arise in Iowa, as it has in other states. So to the legislation. So we have the privatization of public education as one legislative agenda. Then there is what is affectionately referred to as the transparency bill. Now think about that a minute. What does the transparency bill suggest to you? The teachers are working in secret? You might recall language in Des Moines like the sinister agenda of teachers that we heard in the spring. Believe me, teachers don't have a sinister agenda, and they're not working in secret. But model legislation for transparent education has been provided by ALEC, probably some other organizations as well, but certainly the legislation is there in the ALEC agenda. And most recently in Iowa, this bill passed in the Senate but didn't proceed to become law. It's unclear whether we'll see it again, but quite likely that we will see it again. What does it require? Well, it requires that teachers post a course syllabus and a list of all instructional materials that will be used. And depending on which version of the bill is presented, they might need to post all of that information at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of the semester, sometime in adequate advance, so that parents can review all of those instructional materials and decide whether or not those are acceptable to them or not. School districts would, so that would need to be posted probably to the school district's website. School districts would adopt and make a public policy and procedure for parents to review all classroom materials. Now, be aware that we have in Iowa Code a provision that gives parents the right and opportunity to review instructional materials at their request, and indeed to challenge those materials if they so choose. That provision in the code has been in Iowa Code since 2006. So legislators don't really need to worry their little heads about that. We have a provision in place already. Nevertheless, the transparency bill continues to arise. In addition, another provision that we see in some versions of this bill is that students would be required, civics teachers or government teachers would be required, and students would be required to take the most recent version of the civics test developed by the Citizenship and Immigration Services. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. All of these provisions and any other requirements that emerge in, quote, the transparency bills are also referenced as a Parents' Bill of Rights, suggesting that parents don't already have rights, when in fact, parents do have rights. So what did the provisions of this transparency bill mean for teachers? Well, I would say, first of all, it places an enormous documentation burden on teachers to list every item that they're going to use in their classroom that year, well in advance of using it. And make it accessible to parents and make sure that parents know how to access it. I think another dimension of this is that it would limit the opportunity for what I would call serendipitous instruction. You know, so discussion about current events, something comes up in the news. Can you bring it up in that classroom under the provisions of this bill? Maybe not. I think all of us know that we might be reading something and say, well, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. Let's Google it. Would that be allowed under these provisions? We'd be bringing instructional materials in, so to speak. that were not in the list. That may not be allowed. It would also, it seems to me, limit the opportunity for teachers to adapt to special needs of students. So you have a student who's chosen a reading. We start to dig into that reading, and we have a couple of students for whom this is a little bit beyond their capacity to read. Can I, on the spot, replace that with something that's more accessible for that child without posting it in advance on the internet? Maybe not under this legislation. I think what I'm trying to say is this legislation doesn't appreciate the on-the-spot decision-making that teachers make in order to be effective teachers. In the end, could this lead teachers to say, throw up their hands and say, it's not worth it. Here's my textbook. That's the only thing I'll use. And we won't enrich the classroom with anything else. And believe me, I would not want to face a classroom of 16-year-olds with a textbook day after day and think I was going to keep them engaged. Now, the civics test. I want to say a thing about the civics test because I think that's not a bad idea. Just think that students should be able to pass the same test that an immigrant needs to pass in order to become a citizen. My only concern about that, or my central concern, maybe I have others, but my central concern is that I would hate to see a civics class brought down to the level of only teaching to the test and not teaching about and having discussion about all the issues and questions and history behind the facts that are in that test. And if we don't have the discussion about how we arrived at the kind of government we have today, I fear we don't appreciate the kind of government we have. Perhaps most importantly of all, this type of legislation undercuts professional respect that I believe teachers deserve for them to make the best decisions about their classrooms every day. So making information about classroom materials accessible is one issue. Choosing what content will be taught is yet another. House File 802 was signed into law in Iowa in 2021. It prohibits the teaching of, quote, divisive concepts, a term that is rather interesting to try to define, and there is an attempt in the legislation to define it, but it is a somewhat vague term that seems to me will have a chilling effect on teachers attempting to teach anything that is controversial in any way, fearing that it might be divisive. The language of this bill makes it difficult for teachers to think, for example, about teaching students about reparations. Is that a divisive concept? Should students have discussion about that? Is historic redlining a divisive concept? Should students have background and opportunity to discuss the history of redlining and its consequences? Do these topics deserve discussion? Not advocacy, but discussion. It seems to me it does. But this bill leaves teachers uncertain about what they can or cannot discuss in social studies classrooms. I remind you again that when teachers' professional expertise and decision-making is questioned in Des Moines, is questioned in the media, that news reaches the eyes and ears of teachers. And it has a demoralizing effect, even when the bills don't become law. All that said, our focus today is on whether legislators ought to tell teachers that they may or may not use materials under the in their classrooms. Bottom line, the content of school curriculum comes under the purview of the local Board of Education. Boards conventionally delegate that responsibility to licensed educators in their schools. This is the community's statement of confidence in their educators. This is taken from the Iowa City policy. This quotation up here, it's very similar to policy that you see in virtually all districts in Iowa. A bill proposed in 2021, albeit not passed, in the Iowa legislature stated that a school shall not utilize any United States history curriculum that in whole or in part is derived from a project by the New York Times known as the 1619 Project, or any similarly developed curriculum. The 1619 Project is a project that many of you may be familiar with. It was developed by a woman who actually is from Waterloo, Iowa, and working under the auspices of the New York Times. It provides a history, it provides a background in history of the United States that brings forward many aspects of our history that may be overlooked or not well developed in typical history textbooks in this country. It is intended to complement existing curriculum. It is not intended to replace, but it does give us a clear picture of the history and character of slavery, for example, in this country, and its repercussions going forward, as an example. This bill didn't pass in Iowa. It has passed in other states, or bills like it have passed in other states. But clearly, again, the fact that this bill came forward and actually was discussed in the Iowa legislature gives teachers pause and has that demoralizing effect of saying to teachers, maybe you aren't capable of choosing what you should teach. A message we ought not to be sending professionally trained educators. I want to clarify something about the notion of free speech for public school educators. Inside the classroom, teachers speak on behalf of the school district. The district, according to the policy, controls the curriculum content. This is not to say that teachers may not discuss controversial subjects. This does not preclude that. It does preclude teachers advocating for specific political or religious perspectives. But beyond that, teachers have freedom within the context of what the school district expects to be the curriculum. So discussion and debate over controversy, it seems to me, is an important part of education. Students need to learn how to analyze information. They need to learn how to think critically. They need to learn how to use evidence to arrive at their conclusions. This kind of thinking can't happen in a classroom if you don't have any controversy discussed. This overreach into classrooms insults teachers and contributes to the departure of teachers out of the profession and hesitancy among college students to choose education as their major field of study. 55% of teachers polled by the National Education Association in February of this year said they will be leaving teaching sooner than they had planned. Well, there are various reasons for teachers to be looking to the exit door. Political controversies, lack of community support are among their stated reasons. Since 2010, total enrollment in teacher preparation programs nationwide has declined by 33%, according to the Center for American Progress. Most parents surveyed by Phi Delta Kappa International in 2018 indicated they do not want their children to become teachers. Current and former teachers don't want their children to become teachers either. In the 1970s and 1980s, the children of teachers were more than twice as likely as other children to become teachers themselves. No longer true. An Education Advisory Board survey found that 50% of superintendents plan to leave their jobs in the next 2 to 3 years. The National Association of Secondary School Principals found that only 29% of secondary school principals plan to continue in their profession until retirement age. School board members in many places face threats and hostility. Folks, I believe we have a crisis on our hands, and it is crucial that we stand up for educators, that we express our confidence in them, that we aim to restore public trust in our teachers locally and especially beyond. I do want to say a few things about school libraries. On the table back there, I have some examples of banned books from this year, just in case you'd like to see what sort of horrible things we're putting out for children and young people. But I wanted to say a few things about school libraries because it's a little different from a classroom. So the transparency bill, that famous transparency bill, also has some things to say to librarians. Again, it requires that the school district adopt protocols for selection, review, and reconsideration, even removal of materials from libraries. This requirement, again, already exists in Iowa code. That code from 2006 said that school districts must have a policy for selection, and they must have a procedure for reconsideration, is what it's called, for taking something that someone objects to and reconsidering whether it belongs in that school library. So virtually every school district in Iowa already has these protocols in place. Makes you wonder whether the legislature knows what we're doing in our schools. The transparency bill also calls for every library to, quote, provide a list of all the materials that they have in their library. In the field, we call that a catalog, and those catalogs are online in virtually every school in the state of Iowa already. Again, all they need to do is ask us. But again, I would say this is legislation that did not originate in Iowa. At least 16 other states put forward similar legislation calling for these provisions in libraries just in the last year. So is that a coincidence? Probably not. I want to clarify the difference between libraries and classrooms. In a library, it's our intent to provide a wide array of materials. We like to call it a marketplace of ideas. It's the metaphor we like to use. And we stand by this range of materials under a concept we call intellectual freedom, a term we use to mean the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. In school libraries, the position of school librarians is that parents are responsible for the reading choice of their children, but not for the reading choices of other parents' children, just their own. This calls for parents to engage with their own children about what they're reading, what they're selecting, but it is not the librarian's job to govern that. It is the parent's right to choose. In several federal court cases, removal of books from the school library has been deemed unconstitutional because, to quote from one of those cases, the library is a repository for voluntary inquiry. That is different from a classroom where reading is required. That said, educational suitability is a standard whereby the material can legitimately and legally be challenged. It's also one of the librarian's criteria for selection of materials when they choose what they will put into their collections to begin with. Let's understand how librarians select their materials. First, each district has a policy that governs their selection of materials, and the policy for selection of materials includes specific criteria determined by the local district. Librarians are taught in their education programs that it's not their role to select materials because they like them or because they agree with them, but rather according to these criteria. The librarian holds dear the role to offer a marketplace of ideas and to ensure that a collection offers something for everyone or something to offend everyone. Do librarians ever make mistakes? Sure. And every school district in Iowa, if they're living in compliance with the Iowa code, has a procedure for handling that. And how does it work? A parent or a community member can acquire a form from the school to register a complaint about a library item. A committee that's made up of both educators and community members considers the complaint and makes a recommendation to the school board. That recommendation can be to leave the item where it is, to remove it, or in some way to change or limit its access. So we have a system of reports. We have a policy for selection, and we have a system for reports. When I was working in public schools, I was involved in many reconsiderations of materials. Some resulted in retaining a material, some resulted in removal. Every one of them represented appropriate due process. And in every case, both parties, the members of the school and the members of the community, left the process feeling as if their concerns had been heard and acted upon in an appropriate and legitimate way. That's what should happen. In the end, what all this adds up to, in my mind, is a loss of trust. The potential consequences of that loss of trust threaten public education and perhaps our very democracy. I worry that the current environment will cause master teachers to walk away from the profession too soon. And this will create a serious loss of expertise. It will create a loss of mentors for new people coming into the profession. I worry that the current environment could affect licensure. We have high standards for licensure for teachers in Iowa. With too many teachers leaving the profession too early and fewer people choosing this career, I fear the reduction of those standards simply for the sake of meeting the demand. I worry that the current environment will erode public schools and move us toward more private schools, more homeschooling, and whereas public schools were founded on the principle of the common good for a civil society. I worry that our curriculum will be narrowed and will leave out important, even if controversial, topics that students should be analyzing, discussing, debating as they prepare to become thinking voters and citizens. I wish I could leave you with the answer to the question of restoring trust. We perhaps need to return to those questions I posed at the beginning. What's caused this cancer of distrust? As I think about my own grandchildren, I long for a time when teachers and parents worked together, when society held educators in high regard. Perhaps each of us needs to think, what can I do to bring that relationship back? Well, I think there are a few things we can do. We can only govern our own behavior after all, but we can either run for or support local school board members. We can do everything possible to encourage communication between parents and teachers and the school so that parents really understand what teachers are doing and what they are about and what they strive for and what they want for their children. They ought to be working as a team. We can write to legislators in support of educators. We can advocate for testing to return to its proper place. There was a time when we thought largely about testing as an opportunity to diagnose a student's needs. Now, we see testing too often as simply a way of sorting and selecting. And we need to thank teachers and librarians publicly and in person. I think those are the things we can do. In closing, I want to briefly return to those ELCA social statements. We commit ourselves to welcome cultural diversity. Public schools do that. Public schools do that by what is taught and what is made available for young people to read. We recognize the vital role of law in upholding the common good. The common good is the very underpinning of public education. We advocate for the equitable, sufficient, and effective funding of public schools. Therefore, if private schools take away from that funding, we have lost sight of that intent. We recognize how public schools bring together children and youth from different social, economic, and ethnic backgrounds for a common education in a spirit of civic equality. Let us do all we can to make those things real again.